Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Banking Matters. I'm your host, Daniel Baker. Joining us today, we have Victoria Stephen. Victoria is a Senior Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for Compliance Alliance. Since joining Compliance Alliance in 2015, Victoria has played a role in various facets of the organization, including leading our team members of hotline attorneys and compliance officers. She has developed new products for members and trainings, both internal and external. She was the first editor of the Access magazine and took a leading role in the website development team. Victoria has spoken at a number of compliance conferences and schools and has written for many national and state banker publications. Victoria, welcome to the episode.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Happy to be here.
Well, Victoria, we always like to start by asking our guests how they got started in the financial industry. It's a fun industry to be in, and we like to kind of find out how people fell into this position. So, Victoria, how did you get started in banking?
Yeah, I kind of just picked it. When I was a little baby 17-year-old, business school seemed like a good idea. The finance major at UT had several tracks. There was like a corporate one, energy, investments, and one of them was banking. In high school, I interned with a local economic development corporation, and I kind of got to see firsthand how much of an impact community banks have on their communities. So from an economic planning perspective, they play a huge role in kind of anchoring the community. And so banking seemed like a good choice. I definitely did not do any compliance. They do not teach you that in college. I'm not sure anyone kind of goes into it thinking they're going to do bank compliance for the rest of their life. But went to law school after that, and I was looking for a very, very, very niche job in retrospect. So I had to use my law degree, use my banking undergrad. I wanted to be in house counsel. I wanted to be in Austin, Texas. I wanted kind of a small, tight-knit company. So it's kind of narrow-minded looking back at it, but it landed me the best job ever. Could not be happier. So I think I got really lucky.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great that you kind of had that game plan, because I know so many people, it's just kind of like, I stumbled across it one day and I started out as a branch level. So that's awesome that you at least had a game plan going into the college of what you were looking for. So today we actually have an interesting topic. It just rolled out and tons of questions are being asked about it. But today we're going to be talking about 1071. And before we really start digging into 1071, I wanted to start with just a quick overview of like what is 1071, and then we can talk about some of the resources that are available. So give me a brief, like 2-3 minute, what is 1071?
Yeah. So where to start? 1071 originated back in 2010 with the Dodd-Frank Act. It was enacted back in 2010, but it required the CFPB to outline implementing regulations. So we can do the math. We're well over 10 years from that point. The fire under the CFPB was really due to a lawsuit brought by the California Reinvestment Coalition for delaying and failing to implement this law that had been passed over a decade ago. So their deadline pursuant to that lawsuit was March 31st, 2023, which was just a few days ago, and they met it by just a day. So it was released on Thursday, March 30th. So it brings us this final rule, which is a really long time coming.
So what does 1071 correlate to? Like what does it attach to? Is it its own thing? Is it part of another regulation?
It is part of Regulation B. So it's going to be a huge part of Regulation B. Some of the rule cross-references other parts of Regulation B, but to a large extent, I would say it's pretty self-contained. So we'll talk about maybe in a second that even for those areas that it cross-references in the definitions, for example, there's still some reiteration of that in the actual 1071 piece of it. And for anyone who may be going to Reg B in the CFPB's interactive regulations or in the ECFR, it's not there yet, which is very unhelpful. So at the moment when we're recording this, there's a big PDF that takes a long time just to load. never mind actually read it. So we're hoping that it does get published in the Federal Register pretty soon, because that version of it is much easier to process, and that they actually put it in the regulation soon.
I think the last time I pulled out that PDF, it was like 888 pages long. So yeah, it's quite the PDF. So
And I must note single spaced. I'm sorry.
yeah, that makes it even worse. So what kind of resources are available to those who are working on implementing 1071? I mean, it just rolled out. Everybody's scrambling to make tools. What's available at this moment?
Sure. So Compliance Alliance is diligently working on tools. We're getting through the rule and trying to get those pushed out and published for members as quickly as possible. We'll have a featured article coming out in our May issue of our magazine, being issued in just a couple of weeks from this recording. We have a summary that will be published. We have a webinar that will be coming out on Thursday, April 20th. If you miss the live version of the webinar, just like all of our other webinars, don't worry about it. We record and archive all of our webinars. They're under the training tab on compliancealliance.com. And not only will you have the recording, but we also have a reference manual and the training deck that you're welcome to use. I'll also call out our compliance huddles. They're once a month forums where we talk to other members about areas of interpretation and implementation. So we've been talking about 1071 for quite a while now. So if you're interested in what others are doing and how they're moving forward in their processes, join our next compliance huddle coming up in May.
So what about for those listening that aren't Compliance Alliance members? Because those are a lot of great tools, and I know that Compliance Alliance has really been working hard to push those out for their members and to get their members access to the resources for 1071. What about those members or those listeners that aren't CA members?
Yes, so the CFPB did release quite a few materials in connection with the final rule. There is a filing instructions guide, which is pretty good. It gives an overview of how the filing process should go, instructions for what to put in each field, like validation requirements. There's also a key dates chart, which is helpful. It kind of outlines in visual form the 3 compliance tiers and their mandatory compliance dates for collection and for reporting. So if you're at that point where you're trying to figure that out, that's really helpful. And then if you are a HMDA reporter, or if you're familiar with the materials, there's a data points chart that kind of gives a visual of what exactly each data point is, what the respective citation is, how to get to it in the rule, brief description, filing instructions, when to report NA, things like that. So those are pretty helpful.
Okay, so there's definitely tools out there and more being rolled out. It's just a matter of finding them and using them.
Definitely.
So then with 1071, I mean, you mentioned that this was finally released on the 30th. They had till the 31st, thanks to the lawsuit, to get that rolled out. But we weren't just blindsided on the 30th by this. I know there was a proposed rule that came out even before the final rule. What were some of the main changes that happened between the proposed rule and the final rule?
Yes, so there were several changes from the proposed rule to the final rule. Some of them are providing, I would say, much needed relief to community banks, so we were happy to see those. I will say the majority was finalized as proposed. So for institutions that end up falling within the scope, it's still going to be quite a process, so we won't be deluded into thinking otherwise, but there are some definitely good changes. I would say the probably number one is, of course, the threshold increase. Mm-hmm. So in the proposed rule, you were covered if you're making as few as 25, what they call covered credit transactions per year in the prior 2 calendar years. In the final rule, that was, of course, increased to 100 covered credit transactions in the prior 2 calendar years. So again, this covers a vast majority of business lending still. It's not to say that it's a small percentage of what had been proposed, but it obviously helps that it goes from 25 to 100. And I will mention that In the final rule, the CFPB says that, quote, lenders originating less than 100 loans per year are still going to be required to adhere to fair lending laws.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, we always knew we have to abide by fair lending laws. It didn't matter the number of loans originated. The question is kind of how is that going to be interpreted for those institutions that may be listening that are under the 100 loan threshold in this new kind of Section 1071 world. And just remembering that we have the regulators, we have the CFPB, we have the prudential regulators, but the driving force behind this final rule was that lawsuit. It was community groups, and there are so many of those out there that have this very active and vested interest in reviewing the data and seeing what story that is telling. And so they're just keeping in mind that there's so many parties out there that are looking for potential fair lending violations, states, attorneys general, their referrals to the DOJ. So it's not your typical rule. It's very far reaching.
So really we're going to see a lot of potential impacts that are going to come from the threshold increase and the fair lending violations, just because there's more data out there for people to manipulate and look at and review and make determinations from.
Tons of data for lots of different parties to be able to mine and, like you said, make determinations and write their own stories maybe. So that's the threshold increase. I'll also mention the phased implementation. That was a very welcome change. So even for institutions that end up being covered, some don't have to collect until 2026 and report until 2027. So the final rule sets out what they call tiers. There's tier 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 is for the most, quote, active institutions, the CFPB says. So that's 2,500 or more covered credit transactions in 2022 and 2023. That collection starts in 2024 and data reporting in 25, and then it moves on from there. So for the least active institutions that are still covered, which is between 100 and 499, which are tier 3 institutions, those are the ones that have the longest runway to collection and reporting. And I'll mention that institutions obviously didn't know that they were going to have to make this determination prior to the final rule. So if you, as an institution, didn't have a way to determine, or you don't have a way to determine how many covered credit transactions you originated, to be able to know where you fall in the compliance tier, the CFPB says in the final rule that you can use, quote, any reasonable method to estimate your covered originations for 2022 and or 2023.
Did they give any kind of concept as, like, they just said reasonable method, or did they provide any clarification for that? Because I know that's always been kind of a stickler in other regulations, that when they say do something reasonable, it's like, well, what is reasonable?
Great word in law. No real examples of what would be deemed reasonable, unfortunately.
Okay. Just another wonderful gray area to operate in, which is always fun. Well, I know as part of the changes and elements between the proposed and final rule, there was also an element of a visual observation requirement. What's that element?
That was a huge one. So in the proposed rule, it was proposed that, similar to HMDA that we have today, institutions were going to have to collect race and ethnicity based on potentially visual observation or surname. And there were just a host of potential issues regarding that, lots of comments that the CFPB received. So long story short, in the final rule, we no longer have that, thankfully. So not only will institutions not be required to collect based on visual observation or surname, but they won't be allowed to do that either. So under the final rule, that information can only come directly from the applicant.
Awesome. I think that's a great change that they did between the proposed and final. So you mentioned a few times the term covered transaction. Do you have a definition for this? Did they provide a definition in the rule, or what are we looking at when it comes to that?
Yes, so covered credit transaction is the term, and that's really the main term, right? Very generally, it's an extension of credit, an extension of business credit under Regulation B, meaning that it's primarily for business, commercial, ag purposes. But then there are specific exclusions for 1071 purposes. So those exclusions are trade credit, home to reportable transactions, which was a huge one that was not in the proposed rule, insurance premium financing, which was also not in the proposed rule but is in the final rule, public utilities credit, securities credit, and certain incidental credit. And then if you're reading through the materials, you're going to see two lists. So like the ones I just mentioned, and then there's another one, which is factoring leases, consumer designated credit used for business or agricultural purposes. So originated as consumer, but ultimately used for business or ag purposes. Purchases of a credit transaction, purchases of an interest in a pool of credit transactions, and then purchases of a partial interest in a credit transaction. So the difference between those two is that the first list are the specific exclusions for 1071 purposes. So if you were to go to Reg B right now, those are not excluded from business credit right now. So that's the authority the CFPB has under the statute to exclude specific types of credit. The other list is credit that's already considered excluded under Reg B currently. And so you can go to the analysis if you're interested in the final rule, but a CFPB basically says that we think that the ones that we're excluding based on our statutory authority are going to be outlined in the actual regulation, whereas the ones that we're kind of just reiterating as convenience for those that are trying to comply, we're going to put those in the commentary. So if it's a little confusing, which it was to me originally, that's why they're separated that way.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So what are some of the data points that they're looking to collect? I mean, 1071's all about collecting data. What kind of data points are they looking to be reported? What are some main ones? Because I know there's a ton out there.
Yes. So it is very interesting that if you look back at the 2010 statute, it's literally a couple of pages. It was 13 data points, and this has now absolutely ballooned to 81 data fields. So those are the actual fields that have to be reported. If you're familiar with HMDA, as far as how many data points there are now, it's kind of depends on how you count them. They're definitely more than 13. And obviously it's impossible to cover all 81 here. But one that I will point out is that in the final rule, something was added that was completely not even mentioned in the proposed rule, and that's the addition of LGBTQI plus business status. So this is just an example of that. In the proposed rule, there were two separate data points for business status, one for women-owned and one for minority-owned. And there were two separate ones, and that was actually in the statute, and that's a huge driver behind the statute as a whole. In the final rule, they collapsed all of those. So now we have women-owned business status, minority-owned business status, LGBTQI plus owned business status, all in one data point. So that's kind of what I'm talking about, where it's like, well, okay, so you're counting it as one data point, but there's really a lot more information than just one thing in that data point. So lots of other data points. You'll see lists of them delineated by those collected from the applicant only, those that can be collected from the applicant or a third party as applicable, and then those that are bank generated. And so that CFPB data points chart that I mentioned earlier is a really good reference point just to kind of see an overview of all of these. Trying to think. The other thing I wanted to mention is that institutions are not allowed to discourage an applicant from responding to requests for data. And institutions also have to have procedures that are designed to reasonably designed, there's that word again, to obtain a response. So where there's some flexibility in terms of it can only come from the applicant and you can report NA when applicable, the institution is also charged with having these quote reasonable procedures that are intended to actually obtain that information and not discourage the
Mhm.
applicant from providing that information. So time will tell how that's actually interpreted.
So really, they're looking at kind of closing up the loopholes of not reporting. They want the data points. They want you to collect them. They want you to report them.
Exactly.
That makes sense. So I know we've covered a lot of different topics when it comes to 1071, and there's a lot of different elements that we've discussed so far today. But what else should I be thinking about? What elements have we not approached yet that we should be considering when it comes to 1071?
Definitely. So one is the firewall provision. And if you're familiar with HMDA, if you work with HMDA today, you know that that's not something that we have in that rule. It's very unique to 1071.
Mm-hmm.
And just generally speaking, it's about shielding information from certain individuals within the bank. So employees and officers have to be prohibited from accessing certain information if that employee or officer is involved in making any type of determination on the application. And that, of course, is the applicant's minority owned, women owned, or LGBTQI plus owned business status, and then the principal owner's ethnicity, race, and sex.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the default rule. There are then kind of exceptions to that, which is if you meet two things, meaning that you determine that these individuals should have access to that information, and you're also willing to provide a notice to the applicant about the access to the information.
Mm-hmm.
And that notice to the applicant can either be provided to the applicants to whom it pertains, or it can be provided to all applicants. And so we were actually just talking about this on the compliance huddle the other day. And it's interesting that it seems that many institutions are kind of leaning that way, that it's going to be easier to just provide notice across the board to all applicants, or not necessarily easier, but fewer potential pitfalls or
Right.
opportunities for error to do it that way. So that's at least what we're hearing kind of from the start on the firewall provision.
Well, that makes sense because, I mean, if there's a firewall, then you have to worry about people getting around the firewall. But if you just say, hey, if we disclose that everybody has access or that these people have access, you don't have to worry about people getting around it because then you don't have to worry about the firewall.
Exactly. So that's, and again, the notice is not a requirement, and they do provide a model. And even if you decide to provide the notice, you don't necessarily have to follow the model. Obviously, we kind of lean toward doing that whenever there is a model, but it's not a requirement. But I think kind of de facto, it may become one in the industry just for that reason.
Well, it also sounds like the purpose of the firewall is to prevent like fair lending complications and fair lending issues, because you don't want necessarily fair lending items in the hands of those who making the credit decision. So maybe that's something else to consider, is that if you're worried about fair lending risk, maybe that's a reason to go for the firewall instead of the other way where you're having the disclosure and everything. Yeah, but that's actually a really interesting point. I know in 1071 there's also something dealing with a safe harbor. What is that?
There are several safe harbor provisions, one for incorrect census tracts, incorrect NAICS codes, and incorrect application dates.
Mm-hmm.
So for an example, an incorrect entry in the census tract data field is not a violation if the bank uses a geocoding tool provided by the FFIC or the CFPB. So that's kind of the example for the census tract. And then in the final rule, there were some changes from the proposal that I think are generally good in terms of reporting NAICS codes. So those obtained from an applicant or third-party sources can be relied on without having to verify that information. And then it says where the bank identifies the NAICS code itself, so it's not getting that from a third party, as long as it maintains, again, procedures reasonably adapted to correctly identify a 3-digit NAICS code, that's another safe harbor. One more that I will mention is determinations of small business status, covered credit transactions, and covered applications. So, for example, if the bank determines at the beginning that, okay, applicant, you are a small business, and then for whatever reason you realize as an institution that no, it actually is not a small business, you would not be in violation if at the time you collected that demographic data, you had, one more time, a quote, reasonable basis for believing that the application was from a small business. So quite a few safe harbors there.
So for those reasonable ones, they're likely going to want to definitely see documentation and processes and everything established in place in order to make sure you do in fact have the reasonable expectation. And as far as the safe harbors, I mean, basically what you're saying is there's a few out there. Banks are going to want to know what they are and how to qualify for the safe harbor in order to obtain that. Is that a fair summary?
Oh, definitely. And like you so correctly pointed out earlier, that all of these are based on having reasonable something. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, how are you going to substantiate that if you are going to rely on the safe harbor?
Perfect. Well, we're running a little bit out of time unfortunately for our podcast. I know 1071 we could probably go on for a while longer, but I like to give my guests an opportunity to really give the final piece of advice. So this doesn't have to be about 1071. This can be about whatever you've learned in your career in the finance sector. But what is one piece of advice that you would have for banks, either regarding the final rule and 1071 or just in general? What would you suggest?
I'm going to keep it at 1071 just because there's so much left to talk about. Develop your personal implementation plan, your personal action plan for your institution now, if you have not started. And that means starting from the top. So determining whether your bank is covered. We're still getting tons of questions on the hotline about that. So if you're still at that point, you're not alone. If you are covered, what is going to be your mandatory compliance date? And then moving on from there. So how is this going to affect your CMS? What policies, procedures, governance documents, other materials are going to have to be changed? This is a rule where you're pulling in departments and business lines and individuals that maybe had not had as direct contact with compliance, not as used to working in this space. Mm-hmm. So keeping them well informed, keeping those relationships going as you ramp up to implement this is going to be a huge thing. What does training look like? Obviously, systems providers and vendors, where are they at in actually releasing all of this software and materials? To what extent are you going to have to tailor those to your institution and build it out and map it to your processes? And do you even understand your processes if you're still at that point? Like, how exactly does your commercial or small business lending departments work? And if you define it one way, remember that this is a very, very broad rule and may encompass much more than what you consider internally to be small business lending. And then obviously, who is going to test this software? How are you going to ensure data integrity? It's clear that in the beginning exams, that's what they're going to be concerned about, is data integrity. Mm-hmm. So how are you going to go about that? And I will probably leave it there. If you have, that was obviously a very, very brief overview. Tons of people have questions. If you have any that we can help with, we have the hotline. Feel free to call in, email, chat in compliancealliance.com, and we're happy to help you out.
Well, those are great points. I absolutely agree with you, Victoria. If you've got, if you haven't gotten your action plan in place for 1071, it's time to get one in place and get that taken care of. But with that, we're actually out of time. Thank you very much for joining us, Victoria. It's been a pleasure having you on today's episode.
Thank you, Dan. It was a pleasure. Appreciate it.
For the rest of you tuning in today, thank you for joining us, and that's Banking Matters.